Okay, hello, I'm Rhian Williams, and I'm here again with Dr. Kirstie Blair for the Poetry Podcasts. First of all, we need to tell you that the name of our podcast blog has actually changed, so you can now find the recordings and the information on Poetry Podcast singular .posterous, which is posterous.com, and that's going to be our home blog from now on. So today we're going to look at another dramatic monologue. Last time we looked at Porphyria's lover. This time we're going to look at Tennyson's poem, Ulysses. Do you want to introduce it, Kirstie?
Yes. As Rhian said in our other podcast on Porphyria's Lover, you will find some introductory material at the start of that about the dramatic monologue. Mm-hmm. So we won't talk about that in depth, but we're going to discuss a bit the way in which this poem is, like all dramatic monologues, the speech of a single character directed to an audience within the poem. And the themes that we want to pick out, we're going to be not discussing every line of this long poem. Yeah. We're not going to just focus on the first lines as we've done in other podcasts. We're going to pick and choose, but the lines we're picking and choosing will be centred around some key themes, ideas about fame and heroism, because Ulysses is obviously a very, very well-known literary mythological character. Yes. Ideas about leadership and about work, because Ulysses is a king, and this poem is about Ulysses deciding what he's going to do next as the ruler of his country and what work he should be doing. And then that will lead into really the key issue of the poem in terms of form and content, which is the notion of action versus stasis versus staying still.
Absolutely. So we're interested today in how poetry can stage speech and action or not stage speech and action. So we're just interested in the relationship between talking really and acting. So shall we begin then? As we've said a few times, you can start getting into poems by thinking about why this poet has titled them such. So Ulysses then as a single name for the title. Mm-hmm. Is very interesting. Of course, Ulysses then is a figure of Greek myth from the Iliad and from Homer and
the Odyssey. Yeah, exactly. I mean, Ulysses might be better known to you as Odysseus because Indeed. That's the Greek name. So, in his own epic, after the fall of Troy, which he masterminded by having the whole wooden horse plan, the whole of the Odyssey is about his long journey home to Ithaca and all the various trials and tribulations and adventures and setbacks that he encounters along the way. Yeah. And it ends with him happily returning to marry his wife. To get back together with his wife. Sorry, they're already married. To get back together with his wife and meet his grown-up son and take over the leadership of that kingdom.
Indeed. So this is the kind of backstory. So obviously when Tennyson names his poem like this, he's assuming or calling on a kind of cultural memory in his reader and listener, that we will somehow know the significance of the name Ulysses. Although I do think that this poem is actually very moving anyway on its own terms. But we can just say then that this is something that comes after a story, and really this is where it picks up on our other Tennyson poem Mariana, which we talked about being about aftermath and the kind of sideways look on a already written story.
Though of course Mariana takes a very minor character and makes her imaginatively central to the poem. Exactly. Whereas the interesting thing here is that Tennyson has picked a character that, as you said, Rhian, every single one of his readers would be extremely familiar with. Yeah. And that's a wildly ambitious thing to do, to tell the aftermath of one of the most famous narratives in all of Western literature and culture.
Exactly, absolutely. So we can see Tennyson's almost obsession with the idea of aftermath here, but as you say, he's grafting it onto something enormously ambitious.
Yeah, and he's following not just Homer but also Dante, who had written about Ulysses in the Divine Comedy, a text that Tennyson knew very well.
Exactly. So here we see then, but as we've seen before with Tennyson, he's interested in the kind of edges of these things. So this is not a retelling of the epic tale. It's this moment, was he happy ever after?
Yes.
He's really asking.
Exactly.
And what happened next, basically?
Was it a fairy tale ending to get, what happens after the story finishes and you're home and you're reunited with your family.
Exactly. So I think there's something really interesting then about titling it Ulysses, because it's also just that one word. It gives a suggestion of finality. Is this the final word of Ulysses? Is this his kind of final testament? But as we're going to go on to explore, in fact, it's actually quite questioning of Ulysses' legacy, and that comes not only in content but also in the form of the dramatic monologue, which makes it hard to be sincere.
Yeah, so as we said before, one of the aspects of the dramatic monologue is that the reader inevitably ends up questioning the motives of the speaker.
Exactly.
And that the dramatic monologue is really, it's shaped, constructed speech because it's almost always aimed at a particular audience. So maybe if we just look briefly at who Ulysses is talking to.
Yeah, so we begin then, it's slightly ambiguous, isn't it? It actually begins in quite a musing way, more like a soliloquy, we might think.
Yes, as though he's talking to himself. It little profits that an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, matched with an aged wife I meet and dole, unequal laws unto a savage race. I mean, if you were actually a king addressing your people, would you address them as a savage race?
Exactly.
So it's not very tactful.
No.
So you get a very low-key opening, but actually as the poem progresses, it becomes more and more like politicised rhetoric.
Exactly.
You know, by the time you get to the end, you can almost hear the swelling crescendo of music in the background.
Absolutely.
As Ulysses gets to his great climax of heading off to action.
Exactly.
So start very low-key, but then when we get to line 30, 31, 32, 33, the musing to himself seems to stop, and we get this shift, a new paragraph shift. This is my son, mine own Telemachus.
Exactly.
If I'm pronouncing that right.
I think so, yeah, that's what I would say. But, yeah, exactly. So as we've said before, dramatic monologues often imply a listener, and it's at this moment, as you say, in this break, that we start thinking, oh, is this then the listener here?
I mean, has his son been there all along? But if you say, this is my son, it's as though you're introducing your son to someone else.
Exactly,
to a group of people.
So we're starting to see that this audience is now multifaceted, really. There's us, the reader, there's the son, and apparently this sort of third party that he's being introduced to. I mean, I think we're going to come back to think about the tone he uses about his son, but if we just go on and notice some other little indicators to us about audience, further down then in 45 we get my mariners, souls that have toiled and wrought and thought with me. So what is this now? This is now suggesting colouring in that audience a little bit more for us.
I mean, this is the group of his old cronies, isn't it?
Exactly.
That he travelled back from Troy with.
Yeah.
Presumably, you know, now elderly men like himself, but with this shared past.
Exactly. And this is kind of comes on again then in
Free Hearts. Well, there's 49.
Yeah.
Free Hearts, Free Foreheads, you and I. I mean, now there's a you in the poem, and the you seems to be the mariners. It's, you know, he's addressing them as a kind of his community.
Exactly. And indeed what he says is, you know, you and I are old. You and I are old age hath yet his honour and his toil. Death closes all, but something ere the end. And indeed, I think this is what we're going to start to notice, that Ulysses keeps gesturing at the end and then opening it up for more possibilities.
Yeah, because, you know, one of the other big themes in the poem is endings. Like we said, it takes place after an ending. When you're looking at this poem, it's really worth thinking about all the moments where he talks about things ending or stopping or so forth, but then they keep carrying on.
Absolutely, he can't finish it. So he's calling now, so we can see he's kind of dividing his audience, because there's the son, who by definition must be younger, and then there's the older mariners. So we're starting to get a shift here in age as well. It seems to be about generation and responsibility in terms of who, you know, what does it mean to be an elder of a community? In this case, it seems ironically that it's the elders who want to take off.
Yeah, and it shifts. No, there's a shift again. I mean, the first lines we were saying are all about I, but now come my friends, and then it's all about we. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles whom we knew. We are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven. That which we are, we are. It's like a classic politicians' appeal to we're all in this together.
Absolutely. exactly. In a kind of time of dolefulness.
So when you start
to rouse the troops,
and when you move into that we rhetoric, you are, it's suddenly very much a stage speech. You're trying to convince people of something.
Exactly.
Of course, we don't know how the audience are responding. Are they cheering him on? Are they 100% behind this plan, which is to go back to sea and keep exploring?
Yes.
Essentially. Or are they sceptical?
Exactly.
I mean, that's the interesting thing about the dramatic monologue, is you never get the response.
No, exactly.
To the speaker's words.
We're only exactly, the speech just exists, and then we, as we said before, are left to kind of discern what it means for ourselves. I'm interested in how it says in that line 67, moved earth and heaven, that which we are, we are. That's almost like what will be, will be. But also we are, that repetition, almost, I feel as though he's trying to secure something there that might not be that secure. Which we are, we are.
I mean, it's such stirring rhetoric, these final lines. They're very famous lines for the Victorian period as well, this whole idea of to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
Exactly.
You could say that epitomises this Victorian attitude towards
absolutely. And of
exploration and work and struggle
projects and
so forth. But at the same time, there's all this, it may be, not this will happen, but it might, though much is taken, much abides, and there's a bit, we know that we've lost a great deal, but there's still a bit left.
Exactly.
So it has an air of Ulysses trying to convince himself.
Absolutely. Exactly.
As well as others. And I guess the big question in the poem, the question that Tennyson is asking is the reader convinced?
Yeah.
Are we won over by the stirring rhetoric, or are we sceptical?
No, I agree. And I think that's a nice point, really, to move to thinking about what it is that the dramatic monologue's doing in this case. And here I wanted to come back to the line 11, I am become a name, and to think about what that means. Because, as you say, it does seem to be about convincing, which by definition suggests it's something quite a little bit uncertain in it. And so what does it mean to say I am become a name, especially when the poem itself is named Ulysses?
Yeah, and I am become, not I am a name.
Exactly. I am become a name seems to be a distancing from himself. So I wonder whether this is about the dramatic monologue as a form of poetry about self-fashioning. Yes. Sort of making yourself a figure for history, for posterity, for literature.
But also about the inescapability of celebrity.
You're right, exactly.
I mean, Browning writes a lot of poems about celebrities, about famous Renaissance artists and so forth. It's another thing the dramatic monologue can do, is explore what it means to be so famous that you can't escape that fame.
Exactly.
Ulysses can't live an ordinary life because he is Ulysses.
Exactly.
He can't escape his path.
Exactly. And will he ever just become an ordinary person? And when he says, I am become a name for always roaming with a hungry heart, there's almost in that enjambment there, it's the name that's roaming as much as he is himself.
And it's interesting that this, I am become a name for always roaming, but it doesn't carry on that there's a semicolon to stop you on the name. I am become a name.
Yeah, that's true.
So that seems like a separate sentence.
Yes, exactly. So it's sort of held
for
there.
Always roaming. And like you say, it seems that, what I'm known for is travelling, so I can't stop.
Exactly.
Because if I stop, who will I be?
Exactly. I think this is very much about that sort of sense that if I stop, I'll unravel.
Yeah.
So I need to keep going. And the dramatic monologue is partly about sort of setting that down and kind of admitting to it. But then, of course, if we think about what's the case here? As Kirstie explained, this is that Ulysses come back from his Odyssey and so on. But this means that he's supposed to somehow take up authority, and now we find he's not quite sure about it.
Yes, I mean, he doesn't know. He says famously, he works his work, I mine. And what is Ulysses' work?
Yes,
because he came back to lead his people. But here we see him at the start. He starts by saying, "It little profits that an idle king by this still hearth among these barren crags, match with an aged wife, I meet and dole unequal laws unto a savage race." Well, it doesn't exactly sound as though kingship is going well. I mean, one of the big things you always have to think about in a dramatic monologue is tone, and this sounds deeply bitter and frustrated.
Exactly.
And actually it's partly Tennyson's brilliance with words that's conveying that, isn't it? It little profits that. Yes. It's hard to say that in a gentle,
No, you're right. It's
soothing way, because it's spitting out those T's, isn't it? Little prophets at an idle king, and then it slows down by this still hearth.
Exactly.
So there's not even a
barren crags. Absolutely.
It's not a pleasant domestic setting either. There's no fire. The hearth is still, matched with an aged wife. I mean, this is the wife who had an immense effort to kind of keep herself waiting for Ulysses and not marry anyone else.
Exactly.
And now all he can say about her is that she's aged.
No, exactly. And also, when it says among these barren crags, of course, we have a sense then it's amongst rocks or some kind of barren setting. But when you match that straight away with an aged wife,
yes, exactly,
she is obviously a crag.
Yeah,
and the key thing.
Yeah, so she is barren. His life is barren. Yes. There's no prophet. He is idle, which isn't really what a king should be. Even the laws are unequal, so he has no time for kingship. He doesn't perceive it as a profitable line of work.
No, absolutely. And
in effect, compared to his travelling, unequal laws unto a savage race that hoard and sleep and feed
and know not me.
So there's the notion that he's alienated from his family, and he's alienated from his people.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think that line 5 is a little bit ambiguous. I mean, I'm totally with you. I can see that he is very bitter, and he clearly is kind of annoyed that they're all getting on with they're living their lives, hoarding, sleeping, and feeding, and they're not taking much notice of grand old Ulysses, who wants a bit more attention.
Yeah.
And I think that he therefore says, I'm not getting the glory I want here. It's kind of dull. But I wonder if it held in that as well is, look, these people don't know me. I'm not right for them.
Yeah.
I do wonder if we can have a little bit more of a sympathetic reading where we see that Ulysses is starting to recognise his ill fit as a king, a still king, because he's actually a traveller. And again, that brings us back to the interesting thing about endings here is he can't deal with the end of his own journey, so he's going to have to
create a new journey.
Exactly.
It's interesting, and I suppose I'm taking a less sympathetic view of the speaker, perhaps. I'm being critical. I mean, if we look at, there's another important passage where he talks specifically about kingship, and that's the "This is my son" passage, starting line 30, about line 31 to 3.
Yes.
This is my son, mine own Telemachus. I mean, this is about resigning kingship, right? Yes. To whom I leave the sceptre in the isle, well loved of me, discerning to fulfil this labour, by slow prudence to make mild, rugged people, and through soft degrees subdue them to the useful and the good. Most blameless is he, centred in the sphere of common duties, and so forth. I mean, this to me is the most wonderful set of backhanded compliments, where everything he's saying about Telemachus sounds quite good, but Ulysses, well, I get the sense that Ulysses despises it. He's blameless. He's in the sphere of common. It's the idea of he's commonness. He's slow by slow prudence. He's prudent. He's discerning. He's decent. But it sounds so half-hearted. It's like if you say about someone, oh, well, he's a really nice guy.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
He's really well behaved. He's really good.
Exactly. Yes.
But at the same time, I think there's a big ambiguity, because actually it sounds like Telemachus might be quite a good king.
Absolutely, he does sound like a good king. Prudence is supposed to be something that we're supposed to value in a leader.
Yeah.
Discernment as well, and a sense that of course, subduing people is not a good thing. But in another way, he's saying through soft degrees, subdue them to the useful and the good, which is to make them purposeful and to really find a happy balance in life and be productive. And I agree with you that I think he certainly doesn't want this for himself. Because Telemachus' name is just buried in the middle of this poem, whereas Ulysses is right up there at the front, and he talks about I am become a name. But maybe he's sort of suggesting then that to be a good ruler, ironically, you have to be amongst your people in the way that Telemachus is buried in the poem, and amongst common people in adoration to my household gods when I am gone. He's going to leave his gods behind. Is that what that means? So and pay meet adoration to my household gods.
Well, again, meet adoration, it's sort of grudging, isn't it? Well, you'll do what's required of you.
Exactly.
Not more. And
it's a sort of like proportionate approach to ruling, which Ulysses just doesn't do.
Yeah, but also as well as being about ruling, isn't it? I mean, I'm just thinking, that it's really about manliness, which is important when you're thinking about this as a Victorian poem as well. because Ulysses is this vision of masculinity that basically involves struggling and striving and competing and always moving forward, and then Telemachus seems to be held up as someone who's kind of
almost domesticated,
sort of prudent and careful and decent and well behaved and tender,
like the Victorian
offices
housewife.
of tenderness.
Yes.
So it's thinking about these two contrasting views of masculinity, and I think the poem is very ambiguous about which one you might pick. Which leader would you rather have?
Exactly. It's almost as though, do you want the leader who gives you the kind of fame and the prestige and the cultural capital, or do you want the one who does the grind? It's like Martha and Mary. Who's going to be doing the back work? Which Telemachus obviously is apparently more suited to.
And we've only... Gosh, we should move on to our final point.
Yes.
Well, I mean, I suppose what we've been talking about work, we've been talking about leadership, and so forth, and overall what the poem keeps circling round to is these ideas of travel and journeying, as you said, of moving forwards, of acting, and it leaves us with the question of whether Ulysses is going to take any action or whether this speech will just kind of fade away.
Yeah, let's look at those last couple of lines, because as Kirstie said, they're really famous, but I wonder, having already just in this short talk we've started to unpick and question Ulysses' authority here a little bit, or to criticise him, or to take a kind of second look, and I think the dramatic monologue encourages you to do that, as we hopefully have made clear, that the way it's inherently ironic, because it appears to be the voice in a first person, but it's always a poet controlling it behind that. What does that do then, do you think, to those last few lines? Can we really believe in them? So if we have a look, we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven. That which we are, one equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield.
It's the way in which that line is slowed down by the commas that makes it such a great rhetorical line. To strive, pause, to seek, to find, and not to yield. To strive, I'm just thinking about the rhythm there. To seek, to find, and not to yield. So it's nicely regular, but with those long pauses, and there's good emphasis on not coming out there.
Exactly, and that's because of that Oxford comma before the and. That it's sort of.
But to me, I suppose not to yield. It introduces the idea of yielding.
Right, okay, yes.
To strive, to seek, to find, and to do something else.
Yeah.
But what's being done in the very last words is a negative action.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Not to yield to inevitability, to the ageing process.
Yes, and it's also a poem about old age.
Exactly.
And it's a poem about whether you have a choice about surrendering to old age.
Yes. And
or
actually,
not.
now you say that makes me think these lines are in blank verse, so they're in iambic pentameter, they have 5 beats per line, and they're unrhymed, which is a kind of beat that is kind of has a reputation for walking a pace, but maybe by the end those commas are slowing it down. Is this the creaky walking of the old man?
Yeah, or is it the careful rhetorical?
Exactly, there's something held there, because Tennyson is so careful to remind us at the end that these are old men.
I mean, we've talked mostly about themes in this podcast, but I would say that one of the really important things in this poem is the punctuation, because it's a poem about movement and about ending, and about whether you're going to stop or whether you're going to go on. And if you go back and you look at the way that Tennyson is using commas, semicolons, full stops, line endings, earlier we talked about death closes all, something at the end, these, but I mean, both times Tennyson uses end, it's at the end of a line. It's not a coincidence. How dull it is to pause. I'm on line 23, I think, 22.
Yes.
How dull it is. And it's not a coincidence that there's a comma after pause.
Yeah.
So the whole poem, in its form, embodies these ideas of movement and stasis.
Yes.
And action versus stopping, which fits very nicely with what you were saying about the last line and the kind of ambiguous ways you could read those pauses.
Exactly, that last, that kind of, is it slowing down or is it...
Yeah, and you look at something and you think it's in iambic pentameter, blank verse, that's kind of standard. But what Tennyson does with blank verse is create these immense variations between lines, so that the whole poem reflects upon what Ulysses is trying to
exactly.
to get at.
And I think that's what's so wonderful about the dramatic monologue. It's always self-reflective. So, I mean, I think we're probably going to have to finish up there, but I think what I'd quite like to just say at the very end is that this was published in 1833, and it's making me think, when you were talking then, about how this is actually a pause in history. The Reform Bill has just been passed.
Yeah, that's a great point, and and that's raised huge questions about leadership and the relation of the leader to the people as well.
Absolutely. And I just wonder, this is where, is Tennyson kind of please, is this a kind of rhetorical shift to certainty, or is it a kind of creaking of the old passing?
Yeah, I mean, it's a poem that anticipates the Victorian age. Victoria is going to come to the throne 4 years later. Yeah. And it's also, I mean, the final thing I guess I would say is that it's also a poem about what poetry can do.
Exactly.
I mean, it's a poem about, he works his work, I mine, but Tennyson's work is to create poems. And one of Tennyson's great anxieties in this period, a very bad period for the publication of poetry, is what kind of work does poetry do, and is poetry going to ever create any action?
Exactly.
Or is it a passive
Is it always
form?
going to be passive? Exactly. Well, I think that's a good note to end on.
Okay.
Thank you.